work in economic history and international trade. And he has publications in a number of journals, including R.E. Stats, Explorations in Economic History, Economics Letters, and so on. He has also worked on a couple of NSF grants, which is quite prestigious, and he sits on the editorial board of the Journal of Economic History. And he's currently here trying to escape the Winter Olympics in Vancouver, and we are very glad that he chose Canterbury for his refuge. Welcome, David.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful trip, and it's a really nice way to kind of end it, I guess, in a sense, or act as a capstone. I even brought part of the home team with me for support. So the paper I'll be presenting today is, of course, entitled Trade Booms, Trade Busts, and Trade Costs, joint work with Chris Meisner at UC Davis and Dennis Novy of Warwick. And because I think time is probably a little bit tight given kind of the size of the paper that we've ended up with, I think it, being really straightforward here is probably the best approach, right? And so to give you a sense of what we're trying to achieve in the paper then is really some means of answering this question of what has driven trade booms and the one intervening trade busts that we have observed in the past, say, 130, 150 years in the kind of global economy. And what we want to do is kind of set this up very quickly, in a sense, coming right to the punch, is that we're going to turn to gravity, right, for answers to this question. And for those of you not familiar with kind of the empirical trade and empirical finance literature, gravity, right, is this a means of, I think it's explaining bilateral trade flows, so the trade flows in between, say, Australia and New Zealand, right, as a function of their respective economic masses, right, or GDPs, and how that's also moderated by basic components like distance separating the two markets. And of course, there's a very close analog there to kind of gravity in the sense of physics, right, where the gravitational force in between two bodies, right, is going to be governed by, again, their mass, right, and the distance separating them. Right? And to give you the kind of short explanation there of gravity, and we'll go into a lot more explanation there. I think a natural question that arises then, though, after kind of invoking gravity very early on in the paper, is this related or follow-on question of, is it really the fact then that one empirical model of trade fits all, right? So we're looking over vast, relatively vast amounts of time, this period from 1870 to 2000, right? And in the back of our heads, right, I think for even those of you who are not very familiar with economic history, we all probably could come up with stories as to what was driving trade in, say, the 19th century in terms of some sort of relative resource endowment story, a la Heteroline, and how that's changed over time into some sort of stories on technological differences across nations, or differences in terms of the productivity draw of firms. And the question then, again, becomes this idea of, given those very different stories, as it were, very different motivations for trade, right? How can we actually invoke this gravity model? Right? And is it plausible, right, to do so? And our answer is kind of an emphatic yes here. Something that we demonstrate in a lot more detail in the paper itself than I go through in this seminar today, is that you can actually derive a gravity equation, right, or a gravity model, right, which is identical across a large number of standard models of international trade, right? So encompassing these relative resource endowment stories, encompassing firm heterogeneity, encompassing Ricardian comparative advantage. And the intuition here is that no matter what's going on with the kind of sources of international trade, right? Whether it just be, again, in terms of those stories that I've invoked previously, what's going on is we're telling a story about specialization across nations, right? And given that specialization that occurs, what's going to happen with gravity is that this is just kind of indicating how consumers are then allocating their expenditure across countries, right, or source countries, subject to trade frictions. Right? So how much is it going to cost me at the end of the day to import an automobile from North America relative to Australia, right? That sort of thing. Now, that kind of introduces then this idea of trade costs, right, which we invoke in our title, and which we think is kind of one of the primary contributions of the paper itself, right? Rather than just looking at this long span of data and trying to explain the pattern of trade booms and trade busts, right? We're going to kind of afford a central role for trade costs at the bilateral level, right, in helping us explain, right, what is going on. And to give you an idea that really kind of fits this concept of trade costs itself very early on, right, we can go ahead and give you a kind of straightforward definition of trade costs as being all these costs of transaction and transport associated with the exchange of goods other than the marginal cost of producing those goods. And to give you a more kind of practical flavor to this, thinking about what could be subsumed in that trade cost heading, right? So you need to be thinking there, anything involved with the physical transport of goods, so maritime freight rates would figure into this. Also classic elements in terms of commercial policy, whether it be tariff or non-tariff barriers to trade. But we could take a more kind of holistic approach here as well and start thinking about the informational costs associated with international trade and how those would be kind of captured by this concept of trade costs. Or some sort of exchange rate risks, right, that exporting and importing agents might incur. And so, as I'm suggesting here, right, we need to take a very, again, broad view of trade costs themselves, right? So all of the costs involved with the international exchange of goods. And part of the thing that we can draw from here, right, is in the burgeoning literature on trade costs and kind of the international trade and international macro side of things. Where a lot of authors, a lot of researchers have looked into this issue, right, incorporated it into kind of standard models of international trade, but also what comes out of that literature, in a sense, is that we really don't have a very good handle on what trade costs look like, right? What they are composed of, and especially what that kind of nature and composition of trade costs that we note there looks like in the long run, right? So from this period that we consider from 1870 to 2000, but even for shorter periods, right? That we really don't have a good handle of what's happening on the trade cost front for the period from the 1980s and 1990s and into the 2000s. And so this is again one of the primary contributions that we think we're making in this paper. Now, to give you the overview of the paper itself, right? Or not just this particular paper, but kind of this larger project that we have. What we've been trying to do here is offer up this kind of quantitative assessment of global trade from 1870 to 2000 by first introducing this micro-founded measure of trade costs, which again we note is going to be compatible with leading theories of international trade. Then another task that has taken up a considerable amount of time was in collecting this new balanced channel data set on bilateral trade for this period for a fairly large number of countries. And so then what that allows us to do is, with theory in hand, with data in hand, is proceed to the third step, right? And actually constructing this consistent measure of comprehensive trade costs through time. And so consistently applied in terms of theory across the periods, and also highlight this notion of comprehensiveness, right? These are not just those familiar elements of transportation costs and maybe tariff rates, right? That we're hopefully getting at a kind of aggregate sense of what the bilateral trade costs facing two nations are. And then finally, what we do in terms of this paper is then we're able to then trace the contribution of trade costs, right, to these trade booms and trade busts over the 130 years under consideration. Now, what we'll kind of proceed then to, for the next slide then, is just a preview of the results, right? Maybe a take-home message for you guys in terms of a very concise and abbreviated history of the global economy, or at least global trade, in this period, 1870 to 2000, that for this kind of pre-World War I experience, right, which is generally described as kind of a bell period for globalization, with the rise of new technologies and changes in commercial policy, that we see trade volumes kind of exploding in this period from 1870 to 1913. That there we're able to document a decline in trade costs on average of about 33%. And then in terms of the kind of an accounting perspective or accounting exercise that we undertake and trying to attribute these changes in trade costs or this decline in trade costs and its contribution to the increase in trade volumes, that this is actually being to the majority of the late 19th century trade boom actually being due to this decline in trade costs. Comparing that then to the experience for the post-World War II area, right, where we're kind of gaining lost ground from the interwar period, right, so looking at 1950 to 2000, we're able to document a fairly smaller decline then of about 16% for this consistent set of countries. And that relatively smaller decline in this period from 1950 to 2000 relative to 1870 to 1913 kind of leads into a correspondingly smaller role for trade costs. Right? And what we're able to kind of attribute there is that the minority, or 35% of the late 20th century trade boom, was due to declining trade costs. And of course, this is all kind of offset or in contradistinction to the experience framing World War I in its end in 1918 and the beginning of World War II in 1939, that we see in that interwar period that trade costs increased by 13%. Right? So this is the only documented kind of increase on average that we're able to find for our sample. And that increase in trade costs, right, actually leads to the fact that the entirety of the interwar trade costs was due to the increase in trade costs. Right? So looking at the volume of trade in the interwar period, in that space defined by 21 to 39, like that basically on average you're seeing 0% trade growth. Right? At a time that in fact that the global economy is growing. So we have an increase in global output of about 88 or 90% from 21 to 39, but no corresponding increase in trade volumes. Right? So that allows us to then attribute the entirety of that flatlining experience, right, to the increase in trade costs themselves. So how are we going to proceed in the remaining 30 slides or so? Right? Well, first of all, we want to demonstrate to you that empirically, right, that gravity does seem to really work in all periods, right? That we can estimate a gravity equation, right, which it seems to explain a high degree of the variation in bilateral trade flows in separate periods, but also do this pooling exercise. From there, in terms of the direction that we take, we kind of turn to the theory, right, and demonstrate how we can actually derive one identical gravity equation from competing trade models. And then we'll spend some time after that, again, with this idea of combining data and theory of charting trade costs over time and aligning kind of the patterns that emerge with the received wisdom, right, from the kind of combined economic history and international economics literature. And then finally, just to keep our eyes on the prize, as it were, right, we return to this, kind of larger overarching question of what is driving trade booms and trade busts, right? And we run this horse race, as it were, in between changes in output versus changes in trade costs themselves. So thinking about that first step then, right, and to give you the motivation as to why is it that we're actually going to estimate the gravity model in these three eras of globalization, right? And what we're taking as our purpose here is that this is going to act as kind of a trust-building exercise, right? You can trust, right, in a sense that gravity is in effect, right? That it's an irrevocable, hold is at work for these various subperiods, right? And so we're actually drawing from some previous work that has been done, right? And it's just kind of compartmentalized, right? These periods of globalization. Myself, I've done some work with Krishna Pindaker at SFU, looking at basically the influence of the maritime transport revolution on international trade volumes. And so with the introduction of the steamship, right, and its gradual replacement of sail, right, do we see, apart from the dramatic decline in maritime freight rates, any effect on international trade? Likewise, Ernesto Lopez Cordova and Chris Meisner have looked at the pro-trade effects, the stimulative effects of the gold standard as a fixed exchange rate regime on international trade. And then Chris Mishner and Mark Wiedemeyer have looked at basically the way in which the spread of European overseas empire also acted as a kind of a pro-trade experience. This is also picking up then on the earlier work of Econ, Green, and Irwin in 1995, looking at the development of currency blocks and trading unions in the interwar period, right, and the effects that those had on the volume and the directions of international trade. But probably the closest analog that we have then at our disposal is this work of SFU, Franks, and Taylor, right, where they're looking at the period from 1870 to 1939, and concerning what is it, explaining then the actual rise and then subsequent fall of international trade over this period. One way that we can kind of motivate our work is distinct from EFT here is that first of all, we do consider this long run period from 1870 to 2000. And secondly, one of the things that emerges on a close reading of SFU, Franks, and Taylor is that actually they only have data points for 1913, 1929, and 1939, right, from which they generate point estimates and then extrapolate back, right, all the way to 1870 and try to tell some stories about the evolution of, say, freight rates, right, and the likely effects on international trade. And again, in distinction, we're bringing to bear annual data from 1870 all the way up to 2000 on this issue. And then finally, right, we can refer the interested reader to a recent paper by Dissier and Head, right, where they're essentially cataloging, right, the vast majority of papers written in this gravity framework. And what they're trying to do in that paper, right, is perform this meta-analysis, right, by looking at the relationship of bilateral trade here on the left-hand side and some other control variables, but especially the distance in between two countries. And what they find there is that over time, actually what's happened is it seems that from 1950 or so, right, the international trade has become a little bit more sensitive to distance over time. The point estimates actually increase, right, as you move from 1950 to 2000, right, and this has spawned this kind of relatively large response in terms of the depth of distance, right, and whether this is a valid inference or whether just kind of some spurious results in the data that they can refer the interested reader to that paper of theirs for that period from 1950 to 2000. Right, but what we're going to try to do then is offer up this unified attempt to explain the three eras of globalization. And so in terms of the basic regression, right, that we're going to run, as the first step in this trust building exercise, right, is something that we take as relatively standard from the literature, where you're looking at the log product of bilateral exports from country I to country J in time T, and vice versa, so from country J to country I in time T. And relating that then to, first of all, say the gross domestic product, and the relative size or economic mass of countries I and J, and then also considering a row vector of various frictions in international trade. And so the main friction or proxy for frictions in international trade that I've mentioned before that other researchers have used is this idea of the distance separating country I and J. As being somehow reflective of the international, say, freight rates and freight costs associated with the the exchange of goods, but also maybe capturing some sort of informational barriers there, maybe cultural proximity, etc. But you could also throw into this row vector a number of other frictions in terms of exchange rate volatility, the existence of fixed exchange rate regimes, the existence of historical membership in overseas European empire. And as a first run, right, what we'll also throw in here are these alpha terms, which are going to be the importer and exporter country fixed effects. Right? So the data, which we'll turn to for the estimation, I think we should reserve a little bit of a discussion here, for the data that we've collected and some idea of what are the parameters guiding us. We were able to kind of focus in on the trading experience of 27 countries in total. And from those 27 countries, we're able to derive about 130 unique country pairs, right, for that entire period from 1870 to 2000. So we're able to track, say, New Zealand trade with Australia, with the United Kingdom, with the United States, with Canada, all the way from 1870 all the way up to 2000. The kind of selection criteria that was used here, because we did want to eventually end up with a balanced panel of trade data and trade costs, is that you had to have a non-zero observation on bilateral trade in 1870 and 1913, 1921, 39, 1950, and 2000. Right? So that's really I guess a potential point where we can come up with stories about selection bias and something we're encountering in terms of referee reports, and they're curious about, say, the existence of zero levels of bilateral trade in 1870, this sort of thing, and say the emergence of trade over time. And this is something that we are going to reserve for future work in that sense. So we're just going to, again, focus in on this experience of these 130 unique country pairs that we can track consistently over time. But also with the observation, though, that if you're thinking about what's going on with those country pairs, how representative they are of the kind of an average experience of a country in this longer sweep of time, that we are capturing, on average, about 70% of global output in aggregate trade with this sample of 27 countries.
Is this annual data?
This is annual data, yeah.
And something that I wasn't clear to me from the previous slide, the way your notation works, have you got the product of the two y's and the product of the two x's?
Yeah. So like I said, it's a fairly standard kind of assumption, or I shouldn't say assumption, it's a fairly standard form of the estimating equation for gravity in the literature.
So none of them are zero. None of the y's and x's are zero.
So no, exactly, right. So we're talking about strictly positive values here for x. And like I said, we could definitely come up with stories about maybe selection bias, yeah. But we think we're avoiding, at least in terms of how we're couching the paper, we're avoiding the discussion of that issue and how we're framing it, and we're trying to be careful about how we're discussing the actual results themselves. Right? But in terms of I guess you might also be concerned about the actual variation in the xij and ji terms, right? And so we do actually observe some incredibly minuscule values for xij, right? So Canadian trade with, I think it's something like the Philippines in 1870 amounts to about $12, right, in real terms. And then contrasting that with Canadian trade with the United States in 2000, right, we're up to about $1 trillion worth of trade. So fairly large amounts, but again, something that we're reserving for kind of future research in terms of dealing with this zero trade issue. Yeah.
One quick thing. You said that you started capturing on average 70% of global output in trade. Is that kind of over the whole period
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, that probably, it could be, seen as, kind of masking, these kind of long-run changes in the shares that, it's a complete secular decline. Actually, what you find is that it starts out, fairly high, dips a little bit, and when I say fairly high, I'm saying maybe 75%. And where we actually see the nadir, right, the actual minimum for this kind of share of global output and trade, which they correspond with one another very tightly, is actually in the 1960s, right? And we're having a hard time, figuring out what the story is there. So it's definitely not a China-led story, but the minimum, this dips down to about 64, 65%, right? And I mean, we are sympathetic to this idea that China is not in the sample, and people always want to know about this. But our claim is going to be that basically up until 2000, China's gone around, right? So, what I've been able to do in other work is then go ahead and add in, the Chinese series, which are extant, and track that back until about 1930 or so. And you almost see no, difference in the actual aggregate bilateral trade series, right? But where you do see the kind of, spreading out of the two series, with China and ex-China, is right around 2001, right? And you can get a pretty dramatic divergence there of about 10 to 15%.
And
Yeah.
27 countries yield only 130 pairs because you don't have data on some pairs for some years.
And it's not necessarily no data on some pairs for some years. Almost exclusively the constraining factor here is observations in 1870.
Okay.
Right? And part of that is not just that, okay, I'm sure there's a lot of zeros there, right? So I'm not expecting a lot of, Sri Lankan, Argentine trade in 1870. But also, a large part of it is also generated by kind of the historical records themselves, so these statistical abstracts. And kind of the means by which they report the trade statistics themselves, right? So it's very hard to tell whether an omission there is a true zero, or is it just below some threshold, right? And so they're not absolutely clear that what they're doing there. So the fact that I don't see Indonesian-Canadian trade in 1871, am I supposed to infer from that it was actually zero, right? Or say less than $1,000 or something like this, right? And so we kind of chose to err on the side of what we think is caution, right? And not consider those country pairs which are not reported at all, right? Which, presumably you could just record as zero, but I think you're, being a little, loose with the data in that sense. Mm-hmm.
Why did you choose export data rather than imports, given that imports are normally decent measured?
Right. So in order to actually employ the import data, this should just be export-import data too, right? In the notation here, or the slide. So what you're raising is a pretty important point that, you would think that the imports are going to be better recorded, but for a lot of countries, right, we're not going to have the import statistics, right? So we're going to have to rely on, the U.S. statistical abstracts for their trade with, say, the Philippines. Right? We just don't have it for, the Philippines before the 1950s, right? So, if we were, really lucky then that we would be able to, collect all the corresponding export data from the United States to the Philippines, and also the import data in the Philippines from the United States.
But they didn't match.
Oh, they never match, right? Yeah. So, it might cause more, hard, headache than actual resolution of problems. But admittedly, a lot of this is just kind of going on. What we are judging as basically the most reliable series out there, right? So we're thinking of the U.S. and the UK are going to be relatively good, right? But other places maybe not so. So it's as good as well, right? So in terms of the final product for the paper itself, what we're going to do is just going to dump all of this data on the website and allow people to go back and actually fiddle around with the data themselves, maybe add in that sort of thing. Right? And just I give basically these are our best estimates of trade for this longer period for the set of countries, and people are welcome to spend the 3 or 4 years to improve on it that we've dedicated to this. The final element of the data that we'll need then is also GDP from Madison, which will be Madison 2005. Hopefully, yeah, I don't think there's too many historians in the audience, so we can skip over the protracted and tedious discussion of Madison and how unreliable it may be in a historical sense. Right? And I can just tell you guys that, for our purposes, it wasn't really a matter of kind of reinventing the wheel over and over, right? And we'll just have to take the GDP estimates for what they are. In terms of the kind of visual depiction then of the sample countries, of course, relatively good representation of North America here for Canada, the United States, and Mexico, kind of fading out a little bit for South America, but we are hitting the kind of the main power players, as it were, Argentina and Brazil, with the lamentable lack of, say, Chile. One of the things that you'll also notice here is a relatively high representation of European nations, and of course that's kind of generated, of course, by the mere the necessity of having a statistical data collection agency in existence in 1870 to inform us on bilateral trade flows. And then kind of it's spreading out then to the rest of the old world, as it were. Again, a fairly lamentable lack here for Africa and for large parts of Asia. And really the constraining factor here is not the trade data, right? So we can actually give you fairly good numbers for bilateral trade in South Africa or Egypt, these types of places, for this entire period. And the constraining variable is actually the GDP itself. And then that also flows over, of course, into Asia, right? Where, just for presentation purposes, I should just go ahead and give a couple observations on Russia, maybe China, so it looks like we have this broad sweep of Asia covered.
Various ideal countries with borders change.
Well, I mean, that's a fairly relevant question, of course, in terms of Europe,
India,
right?
Germany.
What's that?
India, Germany.
India, Germany, yeah. And there's actually means of dealing with that pretty easily in the sense that we know what the geographic definition of India is.
Do you know which parts of India were doing the import-export prior to splitting into Pakistan and India?
No. I mean, we don't have that kind of really precise geographic information, right? But we do know, what is contained in the borders of India pre-1914 or so, in terms of matching that up with the trade volumes, and then matching that up with the GDP, right? Because Madison does report what his geographic definition of Austria-Hungary is, or Austria, or so it's pretty easy. And, requires a little detective work and a little patience, but it's something that's definitely doable, right?
David, sorry, just to confirm this again. So when you have both trade data and GDP data, but trade data there is zero trade, you would drop the country, right? So you cannot say anything about prohibitively high trade costs.
No, yeah. So again, in terms of what follows, thinking about the statements that will be made, you can always add the rejoinder that conditional on trading in 1870, blah blah blah, which I just won't repeat ad infinitum. So spreading out then from Europe, of course, we have the observations on India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan, and representation, fairly good representation for Australasia there. What's that?
It's just neat to get Greek data, but not Irish. Wouldn't have guessed.
Yeah. It's something about actually Irish trade data in the interwar period is the constraining factor. Sometime around the Civil War, right, in the early 20s, it just kind of disappears basically.
Got Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm. And I won't make any comments on them. Either way on that. So in terms of thinking about the data that we've been talking about, in terms of this initial estimating equation, right? What do the actual results look like when we estimate the gravity model for those three subperiods in isolation, but also in terms of pooling the results as well? And again, we think this is consistent with our aim of providing this trust-building exercise that the coefficients on GDP are positive, precisely estimated, and within bounds established by previous researchers. Right? And most of this is actually looking for, in essence, a unitary elasticity in between GDP and bilateral trade lines. Right? So once GDP goes up by 1%, right, you kind of expect international trade volumes to increase by 1% accordingly. Likewise for distance, right, these are negative, uniformly negative, precisely estimated, and within the range established previously by Vizier and Head. And then in terms of some of the other proxy variables for the frictions to international trade, what we're supposing here is that fixed exchange rate regimes, the existence of a common language, the historical membership in the European Empire, and the existence of a shared border, right, are all going to be pro-trade, right, in their in their effects. And again, we find these to be positively, precisely estimated. Maybe I should pass around the biscuit.
You should have one.
I'm okay. I can power through this. Now, one of the problems, or I guess one of the rejoinders to that particular estimation strategy, right, would be this point raised by Baldwin and Taglioni in 2006, where they're basically emphasizing the problem of the unobserved changes in multilateral barriers, right? Particularly in the estimation of coefficients for these trade cost proxies, right? Say fixed exchange rate regimes, common languages, etc. Right? And the idea there is that basically, well, if you only have observations on, say, Australian and New Zealand trade, right? And you're kind of trying to gauge whether there's some sort of effect of, say, exchange rate volatility on bilateral trade in between the two, right? Really, you also need information on what's going on with not just those two trading partners, but all of their potential trading partners. Right? So it might be the fact that the reduction in exchange rate volatility between the two countries, right, is also coincident maybe with an increase in tariffs in the United States. Right? So now it becomes prohibitive to import from the United States, or export, I should say, to the United States. And so you'd see this diversion of trade, right, to Australia. And this might be systematically biasing them, their point estimates. And so what they're suggesting then, as kind of a palliative for this situation then, is the use of these time-varying country fixed effects plus year fixed effects for identification. Right? And so to give you an example of kind of the size of the corresponding matrix that we'll be using then, for the pre-World War period, we have 44 years, right, that we're estimating with. We have 27 countries, right, and that product then yields 1,188 country-specific annual fixed effects. Right? Of course, what this is going to knock out, right, and drop in terms of a collinearity problem would be the GDP terms for every country. Right? So what you're left with then is a gravity equation with all these fixed effects, and then say that handful of trade cost proxies given by exchange rate regimes, common languages, etc. And what we find there is that the point estimates in terms of sign, size, and significance are all consistent, right, with our kind of naive estimating equation.
If you put in these country fixed effects, doesn't that knock out things like language?
It's a country fixed effect, not a country pair fixed effect, right? So I think that's a little bit clearer there that language of that then would be in that row vector Zij, right? And that you wouldn't necessarily be able to get that separately by throwing in the annual country fixed effect. So from that basis, right, of considering gravity, yep.
Still, we have a lot of variation in trade costs when it's mostly distance and language and membership in the European Empire.
Yeah, so that's a good point. There's not a huge amount of variation for a lot of these. But then, again, this is more, going through the motions of, establishing that, hey, our estimates look a lot like, what other people have derived. Okay, we can go even, a little bit more stringent on this. Is it still the case in this more exacting specification? Does gravity seem to hold? Yes, right? So, I mean, we're not going to push, the actual value of the point estimates too far and try to tell too many stories there, right? We're just, again, trying to demonstrate that gravity seems to be a sensible, framework, for, considering international trade over this long run period, right? And which leads us then to kind of the second bit of the paper, right, following the introduction then, is that, we think that, gravity does a fairly good job then in terms of predicting bilateral trade flows over these, 3 sub-periods. And that returns us back to this issue of trade costs, right? Where we're again invoking, gravity, but also invoking the attendant kind of theories of international trade, right, surrounding trade costs in their discussion in the recent literature. Now, why we take this particular approach, right, it's kind of generated in a way from previous work that some I've done and my co-authors have done on kind of direct measures of trade costs themselves. Right, so I said, previously that, for the 19th century that, I've been able to do some work on the influence of maritime freight rates, right, secular decline throughout the 19th century and their effect on international trade volumes, right? But as it turns out, right, that this is a pretty data-intensive exercise, right, even for the particular case of the United Kingdom, which we're considering that it's bilateral trading relationships with the rest of the world in this period from 1870 to 1913. That underlying this this work of Krishna, that basically we had to have about 20 to 25,000 observations on international freight rates, right? And you can imagine then once you're expanding the set of countries that you're considering and the number of bilateral trading relationships and the span of time, right? The data availability is really going to become an issue. And where it really becomes binding, and I think it's probably kind of an interesting fact for non-historians in the audience, is that data availability, kind of perversely, is not an issue for, say, pre-1939. Data availability is an issue for post-1950. Right? So what you see as kind of a broad movement in the shipping industry in particular from the 1920s and 1930s is a process of cartelization, right? And where maritime freight rates now become proprietary to firms, right? And these are not freely published and freely available. You also see this in terms of data availability in terms of one of the standard proxies in the literature for the restrictiveness of commercial policy, which is simply the level of tariff revenue divided by the value of declared imports. And so we have a really good series from 1870 to 1939, but then sometime in the 1960s, countries stopped reporting, right, customs revenue for whatever reason, right? And it also becomes very much an intractable issue from 1993 with the rise of the European common market and the EU, right? Attributing customs revenue to the individual countries seems to be an impossible task, right? And again, this is kind of pointing to this idea that maybe this direct kind of accounting exercise is just going to take up too much effort, right? And may not be possible. But even if it were the fact that you were able to get, say, really good series at a bilateral level for freight rates and for the tariffs in between countries, we're going to be a little bit more agnostic here and are thinking and kind of state that even in that case, researchers can never know fully whether they're actually capturing that whole universe of trade cost components, right? We just don't know as a profession what is going into these trade costs, right? Again, we have stories, we have long-run series on particular components, right? But we don't know at that kind of aggregate level, right? The bilateral level, say, governing the trading relationships between Australia and New Zealand, for instance, what are the barriers facing international firms at the international level? And so we can come up with a plausible list, right? But we'll never be entirely certain, right, what is going to be in that whole set. So what we take as a potential solution, and as it turns out, there's a precedent in the literature for doing this, is to go ahead and develop a fairly simple general equilibrium model of trade, right? And then derive an expression for trade costs, which is expressible in terms of deviations from a frictionless world, right? So we know there's this attractive force, right, in terms of more bilateral trade being associated with greater levels of economic mass, right, or size, as approximated by GDP, right? And we know what trade should look like if it were the fact that there was no international friction or international trade costs. Right? So we can take the predictions from the model and compare it to observations in the data, right? Look at the difference between those two, and come up with some transformation, right, which is going to be consistent with our theory, right, and have an expression for trade costs themselves. Like I said, there's actual kind of precedent for this in terms of this solution or approach to a solution. And one of the contributions that we actually make in this paper is that we incorporate and eliminate this multilateral resistance, which has been popularized by Anderson and Van Linkoop. And the way to think about that is kind of the average barriers to trade faced by a country. Right? So it's not just what, again, is going on in between Australia and New Zealand, right? But it's also what's happening in the greater trading environment of the global of global reach, right? So what's going on in the EU and the US, which might be affecting these two countries. And in terms of what this means for kind of applied researchers, then is that we get a fairly convenient expression for bilateral trade costs, which are only in terms of aggregate and bilateral exports, GDP, and the elasticity of substitution between tradable and non-tradable goods. Now, thinking about the setup, and I probably should be fairly quick here because I think, what time do we actually end? Half an hour left, okay. So I'll be relatively quick here and just kind of note that, again, we're following a fairly long-standing precedent in kind of the international trade and macro literature, first set by Dornbush, Fisher, and Samuelson. We're in their setup, basically a range of goods being produced, all of which are tradable, right? So we're following that kind of framework of theirs. But we do have other versions of the paper where we're allowing for non-tradables and not really able to identify a big effect there for these kind of secular changes in the share of, say, services and the effects that we'll have for our measure of trade costs at the bilateral level. In terms of their basic story, Dornbush, Fisher, and Samuelson, of what is driving kind of the extent of trade, really they're relying on these cross-country differences in technology, right? So a very kind of a Ricardian story, and how the differences in technology, right, are going to be impacting relative prices, right? That in turn impacts upon the decision of consumers, right, in terms of sorting out what countries to source imports from, and how that whole process is then going to be mediated by the level of trade costs separating countries. Right? So it could be that New Zealand is a particularly efficient producer of automobiles, which from what I've heard it's not, but if it were, and the fact that New Zealand was facing very high level of trade costs, and separating it from other markets, right, would also factor into the decision of consumers. And we also, in our framework, following Anderson and Van Linkoop, are kind of adding into this idea that it's not just these cross-country differences of technology, but it's also consumers' love of variety, right, that's driving kind of the existence and the extent of trade itself. So starting from Anderson and Van Linkoop, right, they present a very parsimonious kind of model of bilateral trade, where exports, again, from country I to country J are going to be a function of their respective economic masses, right, as well as kind of the size of the global market, that YW term, which is a relatively straightforward approach. And what their contribution here was to add in this trade cost element, TIJ, right, so the actual frictions separating the two markets, right, relative to this pi I and pj term, right, which are going to be the average international trade barriers faced by country I and faced by country J. Right? Their kind of fundamental point on this whole exercise, though, right, is that, again, multilateral resistance matters, right, in terms of estimation of the gravity equation. So again, it's not just what's going on at the bilateral level, but what's going on in that greater global market. But in their framework, their claim is that these multilateral resistance terms are going to be unobservable. Right? And the contribution of my co-author Dennis was, kind of a little clever observation on his part, was that you could actually frame this gravity equation then in terms of intranational trade flows, right? In terms of the amount of trade that happens within domestic borders, right? And so the way to proceed on that front, right, is that if the fact that gravity is not just in effect for international markets, but gravity should also work within domestic markets, then the level of trade, this XII, that a country engages in with itself, right, should then be a product of its GDP. Right? It should be also a function of the trade costs within the country, right? And the average barriers to international trade. So if it's relatively expensive to trade with other countries, then you would expect that the level of intranational trade should be relatively high. So that allows us to then solve for, right, by going over to the left-hand side, that kind of multilateral resistance term for country I, right, with the following expression. And of course, we just kind of did the plug and chug here. And that's going to give us then a gravity equation for the bilateral trade in between country I and country J, right, which is going to be then a function of the level of trade that the two countries engage in within themselves, right, relative to, right, the trade costs, both at the international and the domestic level. So what we then do is just solve for trade costs on the left-hand side, right, and again, this is going to be a function of the bilateral trade between the two countries, and what we have to fall back on, proxy for the level of intranational or domestic trade in the two countries. We also do this transformation here, by invoking a geometric average and subtracting by 1, which is getting us away from the assumption that trade costs, Tij and Tji, are actually symmetric, right? So we're allowing for higher trade costs from New Zealand to Australia than from Australia to New Zealand. And then we're also going to express that in terms of a tariff equivalent. Yeah.
What if those trade costs are fixed rather than then in a sense they either do block all trade or they don't do anything?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, is your question more the fact that the fixed cost element is going to dominate, or you're particularly concerned about the functional form here, these being iceberg?
Well, if it's variable, then some of those work and some of them don't. The ones where you derive from fixed cost may or may not work. Maybe I'm.
No, I think I mean you would have a story then about there's going to be a fixed cost here for the level of trade costs, and then the relationship to trade volumes, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have to hit kind of a certain threshold, basically. Mm-hmm. And so what we are able to kind of follow from here is the literature establishing that this particular functional form does seem to actually match, right, where you can actually get the disaggregated data at an industry level or sectoral level, right? This aspect of fixed costs, right? So you get this nice relationship there, right, in between. But again, this is just going to be an approximation, right? And that we are loading on basically the story that's all going to be on kind of that intensive margin.
How do you measure the international trade costs?
So that's something that I'll come to in the next slide. Yeah. But it's a very relevant point. And one which might lose some of the audience on this, and not in a good way. But just thinking about the intuition then on trade costs themselves and the expression that we're using, right? So we're saying that we're an observationally equivalent country pair, right? That this expression will actually be increasing with the size of international trade. So this is telling us that, as two countries, let's say grow, but the level of bilateral trade between them remains the same, right? This is going to be indicative of the fact that the trade costs separating them have risen as well, right? But this is important addendum here that it's in a relative sense, right? So it's relative to the trade costs that they face at the domestic level. Likewise, if, again, for observationally equivalent country pairs, we see a rise in the level of bilateral trade between the two partners. That's going to be indicative then that trade costs have declined in some sense. Now this kind of draws us on then to some kind of caveats and notes. One of the things I tried to draw out previously, here that international trade costs are going to be expressed relative to intranational trade costs, right? And the one thing that's kind of, makes the analysis or the narrative a little bit tricky, and we could probably do a better job on. But one of the things that is convenient about this is that it's departing from a lot of the literature where they're just assuming that basically domestic trade costs are zero, right? That it's costless to trade within the United States, right? But there's somehow positive frictions there in between Canada and the US, right? Which doesn't seem to be all that good of an assumption. We also are not, implying or imposing this trade cost symmetry, right, that I mentioned before. But returning to this question about how we actually measure them, intra-national trade, again, we're going to be constrained by the historical record, right? And we're going to have to rely on this proxy of gross domestic product less aggregate exports, right? And this raises a pretty important issue here, that of course GDP is going to be a value-added concept, right? And aggregate exports that we're going to be employing are going to be gross figures, right? So there's a mismatch there in between what the theory is telling us to use, right, and what we actually have available at our disposal. Right? One of the things that is nice, though, is that tracking through the 1970s and the 1980s and the 1990s, right, so later in the period, right, we're actually able to get aggregate production figures, right, at the national level, right, for kind of the traded goods sectors, so basically manufacturing, primary products, et cetera. And then we're able to actually construct a measure of intranational trade, which is consistent with the data, with the theory. And what we find there is that the correlation between what we're using and what the true level of trade costs should be is in the correlation of well above 0.95. Right? So we think it's a relatively reasonable assumption that we're making here about the proxy for international trade. Now, very briefly, right? Again, I'm probably running a little short on time. In terms of aligning our derivation of the trade cost expression from a standard model of gravity, right? What we turn to next then is this question of whether the particular measure of trade costs that we employ is actually consistent with other models of trade. Right? And so we spend a good chunk of the paper there, at least a quarter or a third of the paper, showing that you could start off with a Ricardian model like Eaton and Cordum, right? Yeah, you could start off with a model of heterogeneous sperms like Mellitz or Cheney or Heltman et al. Right? And at the end of the day, we're able to derive the same expression for trade loss and the same expression for gravity. Right? And Theodore has conveniently also provided the same results then for a Heterolan model or a world in the presence of trade frictions. So we think we're on fairly firm ground there, right? Again, of not only the empirical consistency of gravity throughout this longer period from 1870 to 2000, but also kind of the theoretical consistency of our particular approach. And we think Grossman in 1998 article in the QJE kind of summarizes the situation nicely for us. And really, it's this observation, above the ellipsis here, that specialization, right, is lying behind the explanatory power of the gravity equation. And what's going on in the heart of any model of trade has to be some degree of specialization. Right? So this is really going to give you the intuition as to why this particular result would hold. Right? I think Grossman is a little bit more elegant than we could be in this issue. Right? And of course, noting there that it goes through the kind of catalog of the likely candidates, the likely suspects for what could be driving international trade, right, on the supply side, whether it's increasing returns, right, Ricardian factors, or factor endowments, differences in a world of HO-type trade. So what we turn to next, right, apart from the actual estimation, apart from the kind of modeling exercise, is that we take that expression that we had before, right, primarily this little guy, the tau ij, right, as again a function of the level of bilateral versus domestic trade, right, and this value of elasticity of substitution between tradable and non-tradable goods, right, derived from the literature, and then apply that to the data that we have on hand, right, for trade and GDP. And so out of this, right, we have trade costs being applied by the model, which again we think is going to be a relatively good thing, and that there's going to be no need for explicit estimation, right? It's been attempted in a lot of the literature for trade costs, and by assuming a particular functional form, right, of trade costs themselves and applying them to the data, or this kind of direct accounting approach, right, which we noted is going to be kind of an impossibility, right, of listing all the various components of trade costs and then adding them up, as it were. So for the picture that we have here of trade costs in this particular period from 1870 to 1913, what we've done was we collected that entire panel. So we have the observations for Australia, New Zealand, for Australia, the United States, New Zealand, the United States, 1870 to 1913, all on the left-hand side. And then what we've simply done here is add in some annual fixed effects. And so we're getting some sort of average, right, for all the various series, right, here in the dark line. And then kind of done the same exercise, as it were, right, for various sub-regional areas. So looking at trade costs within the Americas, so within North and South America. Trade costs within, apologize for the abbreviation of Asia here, but this is of course going to subsume not just Asia, but Australasia. Trade costs within Europe, and trade costs between the Americas and Asia, between Americas and Europe, between Asia and Europe. And so what we've done for each of those series, and to get a little, a sense of comparability, was then, from the point estimates, we set those, for those 7 separate regressions, all equal to 100 in 1870, and concentrated on the percentage changes over time. Right? So this is masking, in a sense, some fairly significant differences in levels that we're able to generate. So perhaps not surprisingly, the levels of trade costs within Asia, right, are much higher than, say, the level of trade costs within Europe. Right? And just reflecting that there's less proximity of markets there, and less kind of maturity of markets linking these various nations. But the picture over this longer period from 1870 to 1913, on average, is pretty clear, right? That we have a lot of consistency among the series, and the fact that trade costs are falling, right? Kind of secularly across the board, and on average, on a GDP-weighted basis, that they fell again by that take-home figure of about 33%. Now, one of the things that we do spend some time here, right, trying to convince readers that this is a sensible estimate or sensible result, is aligning this with kind of an established, very well-established literature in economic history, telling these stories about this tremendous drop in maritime freight rates, occasioned by, again, the introduction and gradual adoption of steamship technology. Right, so the latest in the long run series of papers here is that contribution by Shaw, Mohammed, and Williamson, right, where they find about a 50% drop on average in maritime freight rates. And so the historians, that hear this story, they will always point to this figure and say, well, why is it that they get 50? We know that's a true figure, right, because they have the data behind it. And why are you guys only getting 33%? Well, again, it's kind of highlighting that fact that we think there's a lot more going on to trade costs than simple freight rates themselves, right? So there's, again, all these informational costs, right? There might be these costs associated with hedging and exchange rate risk. But we can also draw from the historical literature, which is, again, very well established, which points to the fact that for a lot of these countries, in face of that decline in maritime freight rates, what their response is basically to raise tariff barriers, right? And so, again, this idea of a tariff backlash, right, in the wake of the maritime freight rate, or maritime transport revolution. So turning to the period from 1921 to 39 then, what we find there, again, with the same exercise of having the panel, having the trade cost observations on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side having these annual fixed effects, right? Because again, there's a large degree of consistency, for the average and for the various sub-regional indices. And something that we also feel is highly consistent, right, with the received wisdom of the interwar period. Right? So we know that World War I was a completely disruptive event in terms of the disintegration of international markets. Right? We know that in the 1920s there were some partial kind of halting attempts to restore that international economic order, the Belle Époque. And we're actually able to document, in a sense, that they were successful, right, in reducing trade costs. So we get about, on average, say a 7% fall from 1921 up to 1928. But everything kind of goes to hell, basically, right, with the occurrence of the Great Depression. Right? So within 4 years of the outbreak of the Great Depression in the United States, we're able to document this fairly radical increase of 21% in trade costs on average in between 29 and 33. Right? We know then that there were some attempts to kind of ease basically the policy, the restrictive policy response that most nations occasioned upon the Great Depression in the 1930s. Right? But at the same time, even at the outbreak of World War II in 1939, trade costs on average still stood on 13% higher than in 1921. Right? And then finally, turning to the period from 1950 to 2000, right? And again, doing this exercise of regressing trade costs on an ad valorem basis on these time fixed effects. And here, right, we get a much more, I guess, a different story, as it were. Right? So for some countries, we're able to actually document a very substantial decline in trade costs from 1950 to 2000, most notably within Europe. Right? So this is, again, kind of consistent with stories about the formation of the common market and the EU, et cetera. But for a certain series, right, and we can highlight here the experience of Asia, Oceania, Australasia, whatever we want to call it, where you see a fairly dramatic rise from 1950 of about, say, 35%, whereas at 25%, I should say. 1950 up to around 1965, 68, 69. And what you can actually see here, right, is really the effects of the independence movement in India itself, right? That you trace it out in terms of the trade volumes, right, of India and its relationship with former British Empire members. So Indian and Australian, New Zealand, Sri Lankan trade volumes just absolutely plummet. Right? So this is what's driving this result that we have here in the early part of the period under consideration. But this is kind of reined in then from the period of 1971. Now, yeah.
When's the shipping container one you're talking?
So you have the first kind of burgeoning developments in the industry in 1953 and on. And really, nothing happening all that much in terms of a massive movement to containerization until the Vietnam War, right? And the United States, the Army in particular, is instrumental in pushing this movement.
It was the US military that imposed the standard in order to ship military goods, wasn't it?
Right,
Because they couldn't agree on a standard up to that point.
Exactly, and when it's the US coming in and kind of imposing or suggesting a standard that should be used in Long Beach and Oakland, right? That, that's where you see the, the huge jump in share in containerization. But, right, thinking about the timing here, in the late 60s, right, and then into 1975, and this is also coincident with the oil price shock, or the first oil price shock, right? And so I'll turn to this in terms of the discussion here, right, that we are able to document this decline of about 16% on average, right? But again, there's a lot of heterogeneity here, right, in the path of trade costs, right? So we talked about the experience of Asia, Australasia versus Europe. And there's really no clear trend in the path of the trade cost series after the mid-1970s, right? And the story that we try to tell here is that yes, containerization undoubtedly, increased the efficiency of the maritime shipping industry, like huge, margins, right? But right, this also is coming at a time that the primary cost of the industry itself, right, in terms of the diesel, in terms of the heavy oil or whatnot, is increasing by a factor of 5, right? And so we're not the only ones that are pointing to the effect of the oil price shocks on the maritime freight industry. So David Hummels has a recent Journal of Economic Perspectives paper, right, on this issue, right? And what he finds as well is that you just can't see containerization in the freight rate data, right? And because it's all being swamped by increases in fuel costs, right? And there's kind of a intuitive story here because we know that the share of fuel is such a huge portion of the costs that international freight movers face. And we also kind of point to this kind of slowdown in the tariff reductions under the guise of the GATT, right? And the big round here, right, it culminates in '68 with the Kennedy round, where you have the most countries actually admitted into the auspices of the GATT, and you have the most dramatic reduction in tariff rates in that period as well. And then subsequent rounds of the GATT, right, really don't amount to all that much. So I'll skip this section on the determinants of trade costs, right, which is just basically a regression of our gravity proxies, trade cost proxies on the trade costs themselves. And we turn to this primary issue then of the horse race that we're proposing in between changes in output and changes in trade costs. Right? In order to get kind of a first approximation to the question of what's accounting for the two trade booms and the one trade bust from 1870 to 2000. So we split out changes in output to the growth in output or the growth in GDP, right, and changes in income similarity. And we're able to split out changes in trade costs both at the bilateral level and also kind of at the multilateral level. Right? So there's going to be some sort of unobserved changes in world demand shares and or multilateral resistance. Right? And it's a strict kind of accounting approach that we're able to employ here, that from our basic gravity equation, right, that we're able to kind of transform also offer up some substitution here for the terms that we use. And then we're simply doing, like I said, a straightforward accounting approach of taking logs and then differencing between these kind of terminal and start points. So looking at the difference between 1913 and 18, the difference between 39 and 29, and the difference between 2000 and 1950. Right? So that we're able then to kind of apportion out, decompose the change in the left-hand side, which is the change in the actual trade volumes themselves, right? As we can see here in terms of changes in output, right? Whether it's growth in output or changes in income similarity, right? Or changes in bilateral trade costs or multilateral factors. And so in order to actually employ this kind of decomposition exercise, we just average across all dyads, right? And so that we get average growth in international trade as kind of a function then of average changes in output and average changes in trade costs. And so that, you know, the take-home message again, right, comparing the experience of 1870 to 1913 to 1950 to 2000 and two periods of globalization, kind of interestingly here that we have a relatively similar average trade growth figure, 486 versus 484%. But what has changed in the meantime, right, is the relative contribution of bilateral trade costs. Right? So, you know, thinking that these are relatively equivalent, 486, 484, you see that 290 kind of dominates the 148% contribution of bilateral trade costs. Right? So it seems that, you know, there was this, you know, much larger effect then for the decline in trade costs that we're able to document in that pre-World War I environment, as opposed to that post-World War II environment. And of course, this all contrasts with the, you know, interwar experience where we have average trade growth of 0% from 29 to 39, at a time, again, or on the, in the sense of the, you know, background development here, of output growth of 88%, right, which is then going to lead to this contribution of bilateral trade costs and their increase in that period of, you know, pulling down by a factor of 87%. And in general, you know, looking at the tables, you'll see that, you know, we're not really discussing these issues of changes in income similarity or changes in multilateral factors, because these turn out to be very, very small in a relative sense. So just to conclude, right, give you the big message again, that we're delivering this new method to gauge barriers to trade at the bilateral level, right? We find, or we demonstrate, that the method that we invoke is actually, you know, theoretically consistent with, and encompasses features of, I shouldn't say all gravity models to date, but, you know, most gravity models to date, and that changes in trade costs seem to have played a larger role historically in explaining the rise and fall of trade than in the past 15 years. And so this is kind of directions for, you know, future research then, is, you know, separating out these issues in terms of, you know, changes in the structure of, you know, the shipping industry in response or the changes in, you know, oil price shocks, et cetera. So I think that pretty much wraps it up for me, but I'd be willing to entertain any further questions.
A4, you've got the trade cost between Canada and the U.S. is less than 1. That means it's cheaper to trade with an American than with somebody from Quebec. Is that right?
So,
In your appendix.
appendix.
Is actual predicted trade cost measures? Oh, that's actual relative to the predicted trade cost. I'm sorry. I was always wondering.
So it's the figure that you're.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, that's relative to 1870. I just wondered what that tau is international trade cost relative to domestic trade cost, and I've always wondered whether it's more expensive for somebody in Manitoba to trade with somebody in North Dakota than with somebody in Quebec because of the interprovincial barriers.
Right. And so, you know, honestly, I don't have, you know, the
Tau
number in the back of my head to tell you whether.
But were there towers that were less than 1? That ratio?
Yeah, there were. Yeah, I mean, I distinctly remember that.
Rank order in countries where it's more expensive to trade domestically than.
Yeah. So I mean, that, you know, that's one of the things that we've actually added to, you know, the subsequent version of the paper is a little bit more of the, I guess, the background, you know, just in terms of these, you know, comparisons of, say, you know, the biggest trading partners in 1870 versus 1913 to 2000, right? And, you know, you do see, you know, the interesting or probably predictable pattern here of, you know, the substitution of the United Kingdom by the United States. You know, the U.S. becomes the dominant trade partner for 4 out of the top 5 bilateral relationships in the world, but that's a good suggestion too, right? Actually add that in a little, you know, I guess maybe appendix or just for out of, you know, intellectual curiosity to see, you know, if there's any, not just, you know, the fact that there might be particular instances of countries where it's, you know, cheaper to trade internationally than domestically, but also to track that through time, right? And relate that to any kind of policy measures that might have been put in place.
It also depends on the major cities or ports, like from Seattle, Vancouver versus Seattle, New York.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and that's something that we're not going to be able to have a particularly good handle on, right? Because we don't have. I shouldn't say we don't have it. We do have for a lot of these countries kind of the disaggregated trading information, right? So how much, say,
At least
Seattle,
for
Port of
some
Seattle
sense.
trades with Canada. It's just that we haven't gone back and collected it, right? Because that's just adding another kind of degree of dimensionality to the data collection exercise, which, like I said, is already taken up.
If you go back to the second last slide you have shown.
No, okay.
No,
No way.
conclusion.
I'm getting confused by the remote being behind me here. So are you
Yeah,
talking?
No. Go forward.
Go forward.
Yeah. So here, if I'm comparing the first period with the last one, the contribution of bilateral trade cost, is it that it's now in the last 50 years it's more difficult to come up with the different kinds of, or can I leave it like that as well? We can,
It's more difficult to come up with the kind. What was that?
the different kinds of trade costs associated in the last 50 years, maybe from 1870 to 1913, kind of measures you're including to come up with the trade costs. That is less complicated than the kind of costs we would have imagined in the last 50 years, apart from distance and the things you have included. So a part might be because of that it's not contributing. That 148%.
Yeah.
Was clear.
I'm still not clear on the question. I'm sorry. Like kind of blanking out those seminar.
Let me rephrase it.
Yeah.
So you're claiming that the contribution of bilateral trade costs in the first 50 years was 290%.
Right. Okay.
And in the last 50 years, it's 148%. The reduction is one of bilateral trade costs. So the nature of costs that you have calculated, given the way of the determinants you had included in measuring that, is you're not sufficiently picking up in the last 50 years, which is easy to pick up in the first 50 years, given the nature of trade and costs that are involved.
Okay. Now, I think I'm going to come up with a story maybe that is consistent with this. I mean, I don't know how far you could actually push the idea that it's a simpler time and we're all much more genteel and this type of thing. The past was so much better and so much less complicated, right? I mean, I think if anything, the informational costs back there are going to just be huge, right, compared to what international firms are dealing with today, right? But at the same time, I think you could maybe also be pointing to a story where basically the structure of trade itself is different, and not in terms of the actual informational barriers or anything like that, or shipping barriers, but in terms of the story of this is kind of primary products going from the periphery to the industrial core, and here we're seeing the rise of not just intra-industry trade, but we're seeing the rise of kind of vertical specialization, and the fragmentation of product chains. Yeah. So this is something that we've been concerned about, definitely. And so you can think about this in, or think about this in terms of, particular approaches that you might want to take here. And one of the things that we've been particularly kind of encouraged by is actually going back, not on our parts, but relying on efforts of other researchers who've gone back and kind of corrected the trade growth figures themselves, right? For the fact that, say, microprocessor being produced in Malaysia, and then traveling over to China, to be processed, and then finally transshipped to Hong Kong, for entrepreneurial purposes, and then finally shipped to destination markets in Europe and the United States. And then this is somehow inflating the level of international trade, right? That you're doing a lot of double, triple, quadruple counting. And so what we've been able to do is, again, relying on their estimates then, what you're finding there is actually the contribution of output growth increases, right, with the corrected figures as well, right? Which we're finding heartening in the sense that it's at least in line with our story about the relative contribution of these two factors. So, I mean, that's all that we can do in that sense, right? And especially in terms of the framework that we tried to adopt in terms of invoking gravity, right? Because there are, I guess there's, the work of Kim Yu-Yi, right? Who has a really nice paper from the JPE about the nonlinear response of trade volumes to changes in tariffs, right? And so we've been talking to him about incorporating basically multiple stages of production into a gravity framework. And his response is that basically I've been trying to do this for 10 years. It's a highly intractable problem. And I don't know really what the problem is in that sense, because I'm not, the theorists of us, right? So and we're just going to have to rely on his efforts eventually to come up with a solution to this problem.
Thanks very much. We don't have to change the topic, but we should change the venue. So if you want to
Okay.
join us in the south. Thanks.
Oh, thanks. So is there anything that we need to do here? Because it seems to be
I'll
still
take care of it.
recording.
Yeah,
or
I'll take
something.
care of it.
Come on.